diet stuff, which I'm sure you want to talk about.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. What was I gonna say? Oh, the sandals thing. I think that's cool because it says the sandals didn't wear out. And
it was obviously something little, and yet obviously a blessing and care, they're being personally cared for on a personal level by God. No blaming on the selection. God wanted them to move, and they can't move if they don't have shoes. Did you look up Mount Gerizim, the blessings, and Mount Ebal, the curses?
yes.
And look them up on the map. They're pretty close to each other. I've been to Gerizim. I've never really been to Ebal that I remember.
I figured you would talk about this actually.
Well, the truth is I'm not really sure what, I mean, there's a long history behind Mount Gerizim, even to the time of the Samaritans, but I wasn't sure how Ebal plays into that.
Well, both of them were in the Northern Kingdom, Samaria, later on, and both of them contained temple mounts for the Samaritans, and even during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, that's where they worshipped. So the Northern Kingdom had Gerizim, and Benjamin, and the Southern Kingdom had the temple. So during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, they actually renamed Gerizim Jupiter Hellenus, saying that they were just Arabs, don't kill us, we're not Jews, setting the stage for like the conflict that we see in Jesus' time, where they don't like the Samaritans because the Hasmoneans and Judah Maccabee would pretty much kill anyone that had converted to or had been Hellenized, and that temple there on Gerizim was one of those. And that's one of the stories, I think it was one of the stories I read about the Samaritan man helping out the guy who was beaten on the road, the parable that Jesus gives, where the Levite passed him and the priest passed him, but the Samaritan ended up helping him out. And he was trying to make the point that that was your neighbor, because the portion talks about loving your neighbor. And I think to the Jews, their neighbor was only those in covenant with God. But Jesus took it a step farther and said it's everyone, which I thought was cool. But I think Gerizim and Ebal were on either side of the Jordan.
Hello?
Hello?
Okay, yeah, I think I lost you for a minute. All right.
What's the last thing you heard? Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. Well, I asked what was the last thing you heard.
I heard everything. It's just you were trailing off. I didn't know if you were continuing or trailing off. You turned your head, Parsha. Okay, he's got it. He's puzzling on the floor, moaning and listening.
Well, I'm yelling at the phone. Am I not yelling?
You're fine. He'll see the phone
Did I answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. And of course, the woman at the well, she references Mount Gerizim too, that they worship there.
Yes.
But that still doesn't explain the thing about evil being
curses.
The cursing. Yeah.
Well, I know that 6 tribes stood on the Ebal side, and 6 tribes stood on the Gerizim side.
When was this?
I don't know. I just remember it happening. This might have been earlier. Do you remember this? Alex doesn't remember this either. Maybe I'm making things up.
Look at Deuteronomy 27:13. Is that what you're referencing? Says, when you have crossed the Jordan, these tribes shall stand on Mount Gerizim to bless the people. Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin, and these tribes shall stand on Mount Ebal to deliver the curse. Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali. Then the Israelites shall proclaim it and whatever, and that goes and explain it to me.
Well, again, I don't think it's like the curses are the bad things. It's, for what you don't do that brings the curse. What was the verse on that?
They were announcing that they were giving the warning that if you do, that's where they announced the warning that if you don't keep God's word now that we're in the land, the promised land, then you will reap the consequences. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and they'll send you out into the nations, is what God says over and over again. And that makes sense because they're on the two high places, proclaiming it over the land in which they're going to dwell. So that's pretty central location in Israel, I think.
Well, they're both in the West Bank still, and Palestinian occupied basically today.
Guess that's because they're not following the law. But this is a rabbit hole. We should come back to this. Because apparently we're going to get to that in the next few portions. What was that? Deuteronomy what? 25?
Which one are you talking about?
The one you just read.
Where was that? I gave it to you when I did it. I don't know where it was.
It's 20 something. 22?
20. I remember 27. I'm not positive now. 27. He said. Somebody's listening. Yeah, here it is. Once it was done, both were established as sacred sites, and that's why the Samaritans kept that. It said that once this is done, the Israelites split into two groups, one to stay on Mount Ebal and pronounce curses, while the other goes to Mount Gerizim and pronounces blessings. It continues, it says, no attempts to explain this division has really been given. So, so we are chasing a rabbit hole, apparently.
Well, I think there's even Samaritans today that believe that Gerizim is supposed to be the true Temple Mount.
It wouldn't surprise me. I don't know anything about it, but that wouldn't surprise me.
So it's got a dark history, but it's kind of that's answered in this Torah portion as well. It says, "Don't build a temple." Let's find it. Actually, I think I made a note of that.
Everything about the Northern Kingdom. I mean, they were dealt with so much more severely. They were almost totally wiped out. What they received at the hands of the Assyrians was as bad as it was for the tribes of Judah in the south. The Assyrians were dealt with so much more severely.
Well, I think if you look at their kings, Judah had a good king like every third king, and the Northern Kingdom had 0 good kings. So 3 strikes you're out, according to God.
Well,
or I think it's 4 strikes. They had 4 bad kings in a row, and that's when they went into captivity, Babylonian captivity. All right, so Deuteronomy 12:5.
Okay.
But unto the place which the Lord your God shall choose out of all your tribes to put his name, there even unto his habitation shall ye seek, and hither thou shalt come. So he's talking about the temple, and before that he's talking about like the high places. Like, don't worship God on these high places. It's only going to be at the temple, that you're going to do that.
Which, of course, they never did. They separated and
Hello?
yeah, that's what I said. I mean, the Northern Kingdom separated and removed themselves from the temple. They put in all those false priests and
There's a little bit of Mormonism in this too, because the Mormons believe that they're some of the tribes that crossed over to the Americas, and then they built the temple there before what's his face, Columbus showed up. And apparently you can't do that though, unless God told them directly to build a temple there. But the Mormons today won't let you even go into their temple unless you've been like baptized by a Mormon, because they think they're like the Levites, only they have the true, divine right to give someone salvation. So if you've been baptized by anybody else, then you don't earn salvation. Did you die?
I blame Solomon.
What did Solomon do? He disliked the
Well,
women.
he didn't raise his son Rehoboam to follow God, and he himself went off at the end another direction. So when the Northern Kingdom split off and Jeroboam became their king, that's when he didn't want them to be going back to Jerusalem to worship, and that's when he set up all the high places and worship in the Northern Kingdom. So it's all Solomon's fault. Really.
So do you think we do that today?
I think we're totally messed up today. I mean, what else? Who wants to know who? Who what? Oh, who is Leo wants to know?
Like in Deuteronomy 11:28, it says, and a curse if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside of the way which I have commanded you this day to go after other gods which ye have not known. So, like, what does it mean to go after gods you don't know? Does that just mean like worshiping other gods, or is it worshiping Yahweh in the ways that the pagans have worshipped their gods? Like,
I would assume it could incorporate both. But
just like why we don't keep Christmas is because we feel like it's worshiping God in a pagan fashion, even if you say it's worshiping Yahweh, but it's like the golden calf scenario. They called the golden calf Yahweh. They were still, in their minds, they were worshiping Yahweh, but they were doing it in a pagan way, how they had learned to worship God in Egypt. So just because we put the label of God on it, does that make it okay? I guess that's the question I'm getting at here.
Huh. I think everything about these verses comes back to a strong command to be separate, even behind the dietary laws for the most part. It was, you can't get too close to somebody, you can't eat with them. They were not to follow the ways of the Canaanites or the Phoenicians or the Philistines or any of the other religions that permeated the land that were worshiping false gods. And I guess sin is sin, but it seems like the greatest concern was some of the ones who were actually doing human infant sacrifices. And they're referenced throughout the Old Testament. So it's hard to say that keeping something like Christmas in recognition of the person who's truly just worshiping the birth of the Savior versus someone who is going totally and completely against everything that's in the commandments. That's a point well taken, but I think it would be, that's probably why there's such a discord and distance there.
It's just the only analogy I could think of on the spot. Didn't mean to get close to home.
Say that again?
It's just the only analogy I could think of on the spot. But I'm sure there's other things. Can you hear me?
There are kind of other things. Just like the shepherds or everything else. Some of the, let's take a movie. We go to some of the movies. Some of the things we accept now as acceptable. The language in the movies, the sex in the movie, even when it's not depicted sex. Sometimes it's just the illusion, or certainly things that God would not have us expose us to. Harry Potter is. A number of 2 generations now that have followed Harry Potter and read the books and enjoy the movies. And there are 2 powers. There's the power of God and there's the power of Satan. And absolutely what's being depicted in these books is not the power of God, which means it's the power of Satan, because there are no other options there.
It's true, but there's a difference between entertainment and how you worship.
In society for 2 generations already as acceptable. I would lump that right in there.
Yeah, but there's a difference between worshiping God and entertainment. Like Christmas is a worship. It's set up as a feast day to God in a way that He tells us not to do it.
So anything would be lumped in here that's drawing people away from God. No matter what it would be, if it's drawing people away from God, that would be something to be cursed.
Agreed.
We're still talking about what falls under curse, right?
Yes. Because I'm pretty sure it says something about divination earlier in the other portions. And you're right, where it's becoming something that's commonplace or accepted to participate in witchcraft. And it's okay to do that, but it's not okay to be a Christian, because that's morality shifting and becoming more subjective based on how you feel than what God actually tells you to do. So I think we're in agreement.
Yeah, I look at society as this huge thing. Even like gay rights, we are not to judge, we are not to condemn. Well, that's not what God's word says at all. We are to, and maybe not judge, but we certainly are to look at the fruits of someone, what they're producing in their life, and where their life is going based on how they're living. So we're maybe not to judge, but we certainly are to be looking and evaluating and deciphering whether or not something like that's acceptable to go that route in our life.
I think that was back to the Deuteronomy 13 chest about the true prophet or not. And they questioned Jesus about that when he was speaking at Sukkot. They said, "What prophet comes out of Galilee?" And they judged him based on that, but it's like if they predict something and it comes true, and the only way that we have to tell if they're not a true prophet is if they teach against all the laws in the Torah. So Jesus couldn't have taught against all the laws of Torah, then he would have been a false prophet if he did.
What was the other thing I actually was, as I read this, I got thinking, okay, you've got the commandments, and you've got the other one where Jesus at one point said the greatest disease is to love your neighbor. So that's considered the 13th commandment. But where do things like from, I'm assuming the Torah incorporates things like...
Oh, I meant to answer your question on the neighbor thing, too.
Okay, you don't do this and you don't do that, and you don't eat this and you don't eat that. But that's not in any of the commandments per se, and it's not...
The Ten Commandments.
Any of those 13 that are accepted is what Jesus specifically... I was wondering just where that all fits in. I don't know if I used to understand that years ago, but I was thinking about it last night.
Well, I think Jesus makes the point that your neighbor is anyone, and you should show compassion to all people. But you're also correct about who you judge. So it's pointless to judge somebody who's not in covenant with God or a believer. And Paul talks about that. He says, and everyone puts this backwards when they talk about this, and I think it's 1 Corinthians about the feast days, and don't let people judge you on what you eat and the days you keep. He was saying this to believers who are keeping the feast days and keeping the Torah and living amongst pagans, saying don't let these pagans judge you based on keeping God's laws and what he tells you to do. And they're not to judge the pagans because they're not believers. But if there is somebody among you who is a believer who's doing wrong, then you should confront them about it and judge them in a sense based on what they're doing and bring the evidence against them in the Word of God and show it to them. And if they still don't, you need to bring them before the rabbi or the pastor. And then if they still refuse, then they need to leave the church. And I think that's judgment. So there's two different types of neighbors there. Those in covenant and those you live amongst. But you're still to love others as you love yourself. And that's what the Bible says, right? Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments, which in a way I like to say that as the Torah teaches you how to love God and love your neighbor. Otherwise, you're loving them based on how you think you should love instead of how the Bible tells you to love. Because we all have different definitions of what love is, so we need to have a standard of living.
What did you say about the Samaritan? Listen, I think, look, I want you to go back to the Good Samaritan. He said, what about the Good Samaritan?
We talked about that at the beginning.
Yeah.
So the Good Samaritan, the Levite, right, and the priest didn't help the man. I don't remember the story if he was actually, this man that was traveling was just, a Roman or something else, and he wasn't a Jew, and that's why they passed by him. But they didn't treat him like a neighbor. They were getting stuck on the letter of the law and not the heart of the law, which was to love. And that's the big problem with Sabbath. Like maybe this was Sabbath. They were doing their Sabbath walk and like, oh, I can't help this man because it's the Sabbath. It would be doing work. But we see Jesus healing on the Sabbath because it was more about love. Those commandments were about love. So it's coming back to answering the question, okay, is this love or am I sticking to the letter of the law and confusing the two? Because like today is the Sabbath and it should be like a day of rest, but like Alex and I have gone out on Saturday to help out at the church and do work days at the church. Because we don't consider that work. We're not making money. It's giving of ourselves. Whereas Jews will lay on their bed, won't even light a candle, and try not to breathe heavy. That's not love.
Read. So we need to watch VeggieTales.
Everyone needs to watch more VeggieTales. Alex agrees.
My neighbor was one of them.
Oh, yeah.
Are we ready for question 2?
Are we still on question 1?
Question 1 was relating the New Testament, or what we call the Brit Hadashah. The Hebrew there is, Brit is covenant in Hebrew, and Hadashah is new or renewed. So it's the renewed covenant. So that's something that Messianics jump on board with. It's not a new covenant that God made. He was renewing it because Israel was divorced, which I think Isaiah kind of gets into in that Haftarah passage. Is they were divorced because they didn't follow Deuteronomy and they didn't follow the Torah. So the point of Jesus was, in Jewish law, you can't remarry a woman that you've divorced, right? She's only free of that law, or that the woman can't remarry her husband after she's been divorced. The only way she'd be free of that is if the husband died. So that's what Jesus did. He died and then resurrected as a new bridegroom so he could remarry Israel. So everyone would come back. And so it was a renewed covenant in that way. It was a new marriage. Isn't that beautiful?
Okay.
You sound confused. Do I need to say it again?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Israel was divorced, it says in the Old Testament. A good book would be Hosea for that one. I think I even wrote a little thing on that, if you would like a copy. Hosea and the divorce.
When exactly were they divorced? What point? When?
Assyrian captivity.
Okay, so it wasn't when
700 BC.
Jeroboam lived with the northern kingdom and went off and they started worshiping their own god. That was not when they were divorced.
I mean, it's not like God divorced them. It's kind of like they divorced themselves because they broke their covenant. So they chose to. It's kind of like the parable of the prodigal son, right? So the father let the son leave. He loved him, but he let him do what he wanted to do. So he went out amongst the nations and squandered his wealth, and then he begged to come back into the father's house. This is a story of two sons, right? So you have Judah, the good son, right? Good, quotation marks. So Daniel, the good son, and Nathaniel being the prodigal son. So you had the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom in that story, the father being Yahweh. So the prodigal son is allowed to come back in and be a part of the house. And then you have the story of Ephraim and Judah, where they become jealous of each other. So we like to think of ourselves in exile. Even today, we are Ephraimites. And one day, the two sticks, house of Ephraim and Judah, will become one stick again. And that's your grafted theology coming back together. And what Jesus did was he died to allow us to be reborn, or to allow us to be remarried to him.
Okay.
Redeeming the bride. We are the bride. And then you have another story there. A lot of his parables, if you know history more, they make more sense. Like why 10 virgins? 10 tribes. Northern Kingdom was 10 tribes, right, that were divorced. So we have 10 going into or 5 of those going into the bridal room chamber, and then there's 5 who didn't have their oil, their faith and obedience. They weren't ready. Showing that when Jesus comes back in his second coming, that we need to be ready. So not all people who say, Lord, 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 or cast out demons will enter the kingdom of God, even though they are professing Christians. Right? Revelation says. So I think those 10 are actually all professed believers, but only 5 we could say even 5 groups or 5 churches or will actually be saved in the end. Just different ways of looking at these parables. And Jesus even describes his parables as, because this is something Jared said to me, is that, well, he tells parables to make stories simple. No, because his disciples ask him, why does he tell parables? His disciples ask him why he tells parables, and it says to confuse people, to make it a mystery. So you have to, those who don't understand the first half of the book won't understand the parable. And that's out of Jesus' own words there. It's not to tell a simple story. It's to give something deeper that only true believers would understand. And the self-proclaiming wise would not understand. I'll have to get the verse on that for you. So I think it's important to go deeper into these parables, because he says that. I feel like I've lost the original question. No, the prodigals, or the Samaritan, right? That's what started this?
Well, Elle had additional questions on it. If you start, we need to watch that details.
So question number 2.
All right, moving right along.
There's only 3 questions, if that makes you feel better. What did you find most interesting about this week's reading?
How consistently throughout God's Word he has been with the importance of keeping his laws and following him if you want to. I'm the Lord thy God. I'm the Lord thy God. Yeah. So, how consistent throughout God's Word, no matter where, that if we follow and practice, that there will be blessings and rewards, and if we do not, we will be chastised. It's like from beginning to end, it's so consistent. There's no climate change there, okay. Okay, so what's the correct answer?
Well, I like the answer. It was just making me think of a verse.
Birds? You were thinking of birds?
Of a verse. But birds. I do have some thoughts on birds. I'm just going to read from the New King James here. This is Matthew 5:18. For a sure.
Let me get there. Matthew 5:18.
Well, if we're going to do that, where's the complete Jewish Bible?
I don't have my Jewish Bible here. It's in Florida. Right now, you're not dealing with the NIV. You'll have to live with it. 5:18, you said?
All right, yeah, we'll read the NIV then. For I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. And I think we assume that Jesus dying on the cross was the accomplishment, but not everything is accomplished, and heaven and earth are still here. We still have stars in heaven. So the law is not done away with, according to Matthew here.
Yeah, but that comes back to the question, what exactly is the law? Is it the 10 Commandments plus one that Jesus spoke, love the neighbor as thyself? Or is it every single nitpicky thing that's put together in some of the writings that have come up with, like you may not eat this and you may not wear that, you may not do this and you must do that. Where exactly is the law? I think to finish that, you have to agree on what exactly is the law and where exactly is the law. Is it the commandments presented?
So if we read the complete Jewish Bible on this verse, so yes, indeed, I tell you that until heaven and earth pass away, not so much as a yud. So the yud is like the smallest, yod, or stroke will pass from the Torah. So the Torah is everything. It's the mitzvot and the commandments. And then if we read into 19, so whoever disobeys the least of these mitzvot, which is instructions in Hebrew, and teaches others to do so will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever obeys them and so teaches will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness is far greater than that of the Torah teachers and the Purashim, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. So in a sense, he's calling the Torah teachers and the Pharisees righteous. He says if your righteousness is greater than them, so in a way, like they're keeping the Torah, but they were missing the heart of it. So it's not wrong to keep the Torah or try to keep the laws. It's just when you become all about that, and you miss Jesus because of that, because you become legalistic. And I think it's funny because Judah wasn't legalistic until very recently. Antiochus Epiphanes and all that drama forced them into that mindset, because they're like, oh man, we better keep this Torah, or because we already went to Babylon, we just suffered severely at the hands of this Greek king. So as soon as the Levites, the holy kings, became the governors of Israel, they put hedges around the Torah. So they created extra rules. So you notice a lot of things that Jews keep today in Judaism isn't found in the Torah, because it's added, like Talmudic teaching and all that, and midrashes that add extra things. And that's why like Sabbath becomes this not joyous day anymore. It's this day of like, okay, don't do anything wrong. And then that's where we're getting this attitude that Jesus is battling with, because he spends most of his time actually trying to talk sense into the Pharisees. He didn't bother go out into the nations. He was dealing with those who were close to the truth, who had it almost right.
He called them whitewashed sepulchres because with them it was all about keeping rules and regulations and not about loving God with all their hearts.
Yeah, but you should also watch the outside of the cup too, right? Wash the whole cup.
Okay.
What does that mean? What does it say?
We're supposed to live it on the outside as well, not just have it in our heart. So we call them, full of dead men's bones on the inside, and whitewashed sepulchres. And I think somewhere else is like a goblet, where they clean the outside but not the inside. Yeah, definitely the inside is more important than the outside. But he's not saying don't do these other physical things either.
So, are you to use what he gave as the Ten Commandments as your guideline? Or are you to use the list of things that have been interpreted over the years and added to that in trying to define what it needs to be?
I think there's a lot of insight in studying what the Jews think about the laws, and I think they've gone off the rails a few times, and it's up to you to study those and do your best to be a good Berean. But you got to go back to the Torah and read it and understand it and get your basis from there, not from what man is teaching you.
By Torah, are you referring to Old Testament or are you referring to a separate book?
Torah is considered the first 5 books of the Bible.
Okay.
Where the Tanakh is all of the Old Testament, and the Haftarah would be like the prophets. So the Torah is special, right? Because it's got its instructions.
Okay.
Whereas as the rest of the Bible is man failing to keep God's instructions, and then the New Testament is God coming down and making sure. I think Jesus does a good job of showing the love that was missing behind the Torah, because it was always about love, and it was always about grace. It wasn't law then, grace now. It was always grace and love. It's just man messed it up. God's law is perfect. Man is not perfect, and we mess it up. Am I answering questions?
Yeah, that's pretty good. All right, do we answer number 2 or is there more?
Yeah, and so I would say, yeah, the Ten Commandments. So there's the 2 commandments, right? Love God, love your neighbor. And I think those even encompass the 10 commandments. Whereas I feel the 10 commandments, you're like, well, what is Sabbath, right? How do I keep the 4th commandment? Sabbath. Is that Sunday? Is it the first day of the week? Is it the 7th day of the week? How do I keep the Sabbath? How do I complete this commandment? So the Torah, first 5 books, tell you how to do it, right? So just those 10 commandments, there's a lot of extra, with the fine details, the small print. I feel like the Torah is the small print below each of those 10 commandments. Is that making any sense? Like, love God.
Yeah.
Okay, I love God, but how do you love God? First 5 books tell you how you love Him. Don't commit adultery. What is adultery exactly? It spells it out for you. On and on. Love your mother and your father. I haven't always done good with that one, but I love you. I think it was honor. Honor your father and your mother. Honor.
Yes, honor, not love.
There's a little love in there too, though.
This is what I remember somebody teaching years ago. I forget where it is. They were saying, men are commanded to love their wives, but women aren't necessarily commanded to love their husband. I forget where that was going. I don't remember why.
Well, I think Jesus kind of speaks on that too, because in the Torah, it's like you could marry multiple wives, but that wasn't really, God was allowing it, but it wasn't what was best for you. So if anything, Jesus tends to add more of a description to the laws. Like, even if you look at a woman to lust after her, you have committed adultery. Or up to that point, it was just like, don't commit adultery. It's like you do whatever you want in your mind. But he's making the point, like, if you've already done it in your heart, then it's just as bad as doing it in reality. So if anything, Jesus added more to the Torah. But it was actually, he was just adding a better understanding of it.
Okay.
I think the most interesting thing I heard was one guy teaching on the birds. So you mentioned the birds before. And we don't really know what birds they're talking about here. Like, what are the unclean birds versus the clean birds? And they describe the animals by their hooves, if it's cloven hoof or whatever. And he said you'll know them by like their flight or their wings. So I wonder if there's like a way to know, like if they have a certain shaped wing, that's a clean bird versus an unclean bird.
Is that like some winged swarming creatures?
Yes, something like that. I meant to look into it before we got on the call.
Although birds are not allowed to.
The what?
At least all the birds are not allowed to fly.
But we don't know what those birds are, like today.
Ostriches?
Well, like that's man guessing, like the original Hebrew, we don't actually know. I don't know, that was a rabbit hole, but I thought that was interesting.
Now, going up your rabbit hole, I look at Deuteronomy 6.
Shema.
It talks about the Shema. Hear, O Lord, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your heart. Impress them on your children, which is what Solomon failed to do. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them to your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates.
I got them on my doorpost.
So were they actually saying that you have to wear the phylacteries and the tefillin, or were they just trying to say you need to keep a consciousness of God always before you?
That's how I always took it.
I think definitely both. For me, it's I have him on my doorpost. So I see it when I leave, and anyone sees it when they come in. So it's the Shema. And that's why they touch it, is to remind you, like, hey, live set apart. And that's why I wear the tzitzits. I'm literally binding them to my body by my pockets. So anytime I go in and out of my pocket, and if you're a chiropractor pulling an activator, that's a lot. So that reminds me, hey, remember these laws, remember Yahweh. And like it should be in your heart, right? But what did Christians do? We had the WWJD bracelet. So the tzitzit is just like the biblically prescribed version of the WWJD bracelet. It's just God already thought of it before somebody decided that it was a good marketing plan. It's what would Jesus do? And when Jesus kept the Torah, he kept the feast days, and that he spent his whole ministry supporting that. And the woman that grabbed onto his garment, she actually, in the Jewish Bible, it grabbed onto his
Hem.
grabbed onto his
Actually grabbing onto his
tzitzit.
tassels.
Yeah, grabbed onto his tassel. So he was wearing tzitzit. So if tzitzits were good enough for Jesus, then I will wear them. But as far as like binding them to the forehead, and I don't know.
Well, I mean, I'm taking up an offshoot on that. Then, let's say the person who marries and has scripture or something put on their wedding band for a reminder of God that they look at it every single time they use their hand for something. Would that be comparable, or was that not counting?
I think that's exactly it. Like people ask me what the tzitzit is, why are you wearing this thing? I'm like, well, it's like my wedding ring to God. It's like, yeah, like I take my wedding ring off when I go to the gym, right? Because I don't want to scratch it up. So it's like, but it's still in my heart. I know I'm married to Alex, and the heart is more important than me wearing the wedding ring, right? So my heart is more important than me wearing the tzitzits. Like if I'm going swimming, I'm probably not going to wear my tzitzits. Or if I go to the gym, I'm probably not going to wear them. But it's still in my heart. But when I can, I like to wear them because it reminds me, and the Bible says to wear them.
Well, where you draw the line, Al wants to know, what if it's written on your check for your checkbook?
What on my checkbook?
Or on your car license plate? Or on your keychain?
The Bible doesn't tell me to put them on my keychain or my car.
They didn't have them back then, but is that not a reminder to keep God before you, wherever you put it, however you place it?
Well, God told me to wear them on the hem of my garment, the four corners. A couple times.
And God didn't consider that there might be other options to be just as pertinent?
Why would you question that? Why don't you go ask God? I mean.
Well, I'm just wondering, was it applicable to that specific time that today there's other options?
Well, I think we got to be careful about adding to or taking away, because then we're modifying. It's like, can you really sleep well at night saying like, oh, I'm sure God would be okay with this?
So to have it on the wedding band does count or does not count?
Well, the wedding band is a covenant between me and Alexandra.
No, if my wedding band has a cross and a dove and things to remind me of God's constant part in my life, constant presence in my life.
That's great, but it's not a specific commandment.
The reminder that God's constant present in your life.
I don't think there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not a specific commandment. Whereas the Zitziot is a specific commandment. There's a specific way of making it, that it would have a blue cord and be linen and wool. The linen, showing that your purity and your righteousness, and the blue is the royalty, to remind you that you are a set-apart priesthood, like Hebrews talks about.
I see that listed in the Shema, but I don't see it listed specifically as one of the commandments.
For the Zitzit, it's like Deuteronomy 15.
It's also in Numbers too. I can't remember. We want to look those up. Alex, why don't you look those up for us? Alex will look up the verses on those while I read question 3. Did Father have a most interesting thing to finish up question 2 here?
No, I think I just know that, like, when I was reading this, I was like really in a scene, like, where exactly is the cutoff between exactly what God or Jesus would have us keep versus.
I think that's the $1 million question there, Mom. I'm still trying to figure that one out. Because it brings up other questions, like I think at the end of the Torah portion, it was talking about the 3 feasts that man should keep in Jerusalem. All right, so we don't have a temple, we don't have a priesthood, so we really can't even keep Passover as prescribed. But like you said, wearing a wedding ring to remember, so I can still hold a memorial service where I honor the Passover. I can't keep it as biblically prescribed, right? When we think about Daniel, when he would pray in Babylon, he was in exile just as we're in exile. We're not living in the land, and we know that in millennial reign we'll be in the land, and then the whole thing is returning to the Garden of Eden. The whole earth will be the Garden of Eden. It's the renewed earth, is just as his plan was with Adam and Eve. So we know that the feast days will be continued then, and when the temple is there, God being the temple in the future. So Daniel in Babylon, he couldn't keep the Olah Tamid, which was the daily sacrifice, but he did it through prayer. So that sacrifice was done 3 times a day. So what he would do, he would pray 3 times a day. That's what his way of memorializing it. So that's why we try to keep Passover in quotation marks. We're memorializing. We obviously can't keep it perfectly because we're not in the land. You're supposed to be in Jerusalem. It's supposed to be the temple. It's supposed to be specific lambs. And the same with the other 3 feasts, which were Shavuot and Sukkot, right?
So anyway, the verse we're talking about in Numbers, it's Numbers 15:37. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, throughout the generations to come, you are to make tassels on the corners of your garments, with a blue cord on each tassel. You will have these tassels to look at, so you will remember all the commands of the Lord, that you may obey them and not prostitute yourselves by going after the lust of your own heart and eyes. Then you will remember to obey all my commands and will be consecrated to your God. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God." So, is the man who wears the phylactery or the tassels more righteous than the woman who wears the bracelet or the ring?
Depends on the heart.
It's the same purpose and served in the end.
There's no commandment to wear the tefillin, which is a good point Alex just made. Whereas the tzitzit is a specific command. And no, the righteousness is not different. I think that was the whole point of the New Testament, and Paul is showing that it was the heart. It's more important. But
were these tassels, was the command given to women or just to men?
It's not specified. in Judaism, only men wear them, but in Messianic communities, a lot of women wear them because it's not specified.
That's interesting.
Alex doesn't wear them, but she's got one on her purse, and her mother wears them. And yeah, it's like the ring might be better for you, but there's still that commandment too.
Is it a commandment, though, or is that given as a reminder to keep the commandments?
It's a good reminder, so it might not be a commandment in itself, but it seems like an instruction to me. It's a commandment to remind you to keep the commandments, because God knows that we're not as focused as we should be. So we know we need reminders.
Well, clearly the Jews have given a lot of attention to this over the years, or these little boxes of phylacteries and stuff they wear on the head would not be so popular among the strictly observant Jews, because they're taking this as a literal commandment. That's what we're talking about. Or do you just mean a yarmulke? Yarmulkes aren't specifically referenced to any of this, are they?
No, they're not.
Yeah. That has to do with the head cover, or is that?
Yeah, there's something about covering your head.
Yeah, there's something about covering your head. Like when we did the blessings, I put that prayer shawl over me and Alex that you got me. So last night we did that. And like even those blessings, right, they're not in the Torah. They're not commanded, the blessings over the wine and the bread. So those are things that we just do. So it's not like we can't do things outside the Torah. It's just like looking at things that the pagans have done and trying to make sure that we're not worshiping God with pagan ways. Because a lot of these traditions, something wrong with tradition in Judaism, were created during the exile. It's like, how do we continue worshiping God without the temple and without the Levitical order? So they came up with a lot of different ways of memorializing the feast days and keeping Sabbath.
I was wondering too about, like, all right, the home that had on the door frame.
What's that called? I can't remember. Mezuzah.
The mezuzah with your verse, of course, from the Shema isn't supposed to be inside the mezuzah.
Shema. It's the Shema.
Shema.
Boker Tov.
Shema. Which would be right, because Shema would not have been a. Anyway.
Yeah, mine has a scroll in it.
What about the Christian home then that has in their doorway when you come in and out of the house, like a scripture verse or a reference to, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord, for example, which is a reminder.
There's nothing wrong with it.
Is that less righteous or more good?
Well, there's no commandment for a mezuzah.
Yeah.
There's no commandment for a mezuzah either.
The entire store, as well as. But I'm just wondering about the household that has the verse, as for me and my house. A lot of it's a very popular one for Christians to have in their entryway. As for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord as a reminder. Does that fulfill this or no?
There's no command to have a mezuzah.
Just to have.
But it has to do with binding it on your forehead and remembering so that it's constantly before you is what it ties into. None of these would be considered a command, not one of the 10 commandments, but all of these address the importance that God is putting forth to constantly have Him before you and to be impressing them on your children and to set that example to your children when you sit down at home and when you walk along the road. In other words, it's to be constantly a component of our life and not negated.
I think all that's good. You run into problems when you're like, all right, well, I'm gonna have this evergreen tree be a reminder of everlasting life, and this is gonna remind me of Jesus. When clearly, if we look at history, pagans have used this, and even Scripture says, be careful of people who cut down trees in the forest and tack them with golden ornaments and hang them in their homes. This is a pagan way to worship God, even if you're saying that it's Yahweh. That's the whole golden
No, I'm not
calf
talking
story.
about running off and worshiping a tree. I'm talking about something very specific, like taking a verse, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord.
That's what I'm saying. Like pagans,
So that's
pagans
what-
weren't obviously taking verses out of Joshua and putting them on the walls in their home. So that's not a pagan thing, and that's something you can certainly do. Just like the mezuzah isn't a specific commandment, it's okay that I do it.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I love the concept of the mezuzah. I'm not questioning it. I think it's a great blessing. I think it definitely belongs in.
There's nothing
the home
special
over
about
something
that verse.
That would be the equivalent in the home.
The Shema, like, even if you look at that word in Hebrew, Shema is hear, like hear, O Israel, the first part of that. It's also in the understanding that hear and obey. So you're listening and obeying. So it's just a good verse. It's like, so me and my house will serve the Lord, that's good. But Shema kind of more reminds you of hear and obey the mitzvot, the instruction of God. How do you serve the Lord?
Okay. Did we answer number 2 yet?
Yeah. Number 3 is, what is the general
All right, what's number 3?
what is the general theme of this reading, and how does it apply to our lives today? Which I think we just kind of answered.
Okay.
We're already ahead of the game there. I don't think there's a question 4. No, I have 2. As far as like eating, because there's difference of like what is kosher, like even that is very different than what the Torah talks about. Good example would be cheese and meat, right? When you go there in Israel, they only have cheese and fish in the mornings. They don't consider fish meat, and then they'll have only meat at dinner to keep those two things separate. But all it talks about in the Torah is don't boil a calf in its mother's milk, which is a specific pagan practice. Like, don't do that. But like Jews added to it. They're like, don't even eat cheese and meat. Don't put cheese on your burger. But that's not what it says. And as far as
And
like,
a lot of people think that we're sort of in Peter, where the division, where the animals are being let down, and then they said, don't call anything unclean. A lot of people think that's about diet. It really had nothing to do with diet, to the best of what I understood.
yeah,
It has to do with.
even if you read that in context, you go to the end, it's Peter wasn't eating with Gentiles. For the first 5 years after Jesus ascended on Shavuot, they mainly stayed in Jerusalem. And it wasn't until Paul came along that they went out to the nations. So Peter was kind of stuck with this Judaic teaching of don't even eat with Gentiles, which wasn't a thing that's a Torah commandment. That was never a Torah commandment. That was a Judaic commandment that was added later in the Talmudic teachings and the hand washing thing too. That's not in the Torah. There's another thing that Jesus talked about. So it wasn't about, it was, yes, because Gentiles were considered unclean. So those were what were symbolized in the blanket of their sheet that was coming down, that don't call unclean what I've called clean, saying that these people were always allowed to be a part of Israel and come into covenant with God and to be reborn.
Okay, good.
It was an analogy that you would understand.
Alex said it was a good analogy that he would understand.
What?
Alex said it was a good analogy that Peter would understand.
Yes, I agree.
Because he had to show to Peter the 3 times, and Peter was like, no, I'm not going to eat things that are unclean. Showing that even after 5 years, he was still, that Jesus never taught against the Torah of eating clean. Okay. And then he got it finally that it was about those people that he was meeting with, the Gentiles. And I think the commandments for clean and unclean have always been a thing, even since the garden, because we see Noah knew the difference between clean and unclean because he brought them onto the ark in that order. And we see even him doing sacrifices, and he had an understanding of the Torah instructions. I just think they were always there, they just hadn't been written down until Mount Sinai.
Wait, go back and explain one more thing to me, because I'm not sure what you were saying. You were talking about eating meat, a cheeseburger. I'm assuming you do not eat a cheeseburger, correct? Or were you using as an example?
I eat cheeseburgers because the only commandment against eating cheese with meat is saying don't boil a calf in its mother's milk.
But I thought at one point you weren't eating shrimp or lobster.
I don't, because it specifically tells me not to.
Okay.
The boiling a calf in its mother's milk was a pagan practice. It literally means that. It's not an analogy for don't eat cheese with meat. That's the Judaic understanding today, but it's literally what the Bible says is don't eat cheese, or don't boil a calf in its mother's milk. Not you can't have cheese within the same meal.
And which commandment is that?
I don't remember the verse. I'll Google. I think that was in this chapter.
I mean, about the mother's milk, yeah, I did know exactly where that is. I'm asking where the commandment is about not eating shrimp, for example.
Anything in the sea has to have scales. That's what you know is clean. So things
Yeah, but
with.
that's not listed as one of the commandments.
What do you mean by commandments?
They also shrimp have scales. I don't think there's scales in the sense that they're talking about.
When you think about anything that's predatory is unclean. Anything that eats dead things, which is the job of shrimp and lobsters, they are.
I'm assuming, right? Are they bottom feeder thingies?
Yeah, shrimp and lobsters are all bottom feeders. They eat the dead, decaying things on the bottom of the ocean. And
But catfish is unclean, is it not? Is it catfish unclean?
Catfish are also unclean because they don't have scales. Like a shark doesn't have scales, so it's unclean. We also know it's a predator. It makes it unclean.
The bottom feeders. Okay.
Whereas, like a pig, also unclean because it doesn't chew the cud, and it eats anything. Pig will eat a dead body. Pig will eat. They're disgusting creatures. They're garbage cans. They're what cleans up the garbage. They have a purpose.
What if the pig has been raised organic? What if the pig has been raised organic? It's never had dead. It's never had anything but healthy fruits and vegetables in its diet. Is that pig unclean, or is it?
A good verse would be like, "Don't call holy what I have called unholy." You can't make things that are unclean clean. I think that's what man's been trying to do from the beginning. It's like, oh, this is okay to do.
Okay, so it's no good to eat organic pigs.
They store a lot of fat. Pigs are the closest to humans as far as the skin, right? So they absorb so many toxins into their skin. That's why they're really bad. And it's really hard to bake out parasites out of pigs. Even if you bake it for a while, there still can be parasitics in them, and that's why a lot of people get that those worms, I forget what they're called, in the muscle from eating pork. It's these toxins, and like eating Snickers isn't condemned in the Bible, but it's that heart too. It comes back to the heart of the matter, right? So there's specific commandments, but there's also the heart of the matter, which is take care of your body, which is the overall premise, right? So people get hung up on oh, don't eat shrimp, but I can go eat candy bars and burgers all I want, and no, that's not good either. Don't be a glutton. It's the heart of the matter.
But was it given for any of those reasons, or was it given for the purpose of separation? Because going back to the whole reason we just read the verses in Deuteronomy, is God's command was not to mix with these people, not to take on any of their beliefs, not to follow in any of their paths. And clearly, if you cannot eat what they're eating, you can't sit down with them and have a meal and fellowship. So was it not more a good component of separation?
You could still eat with people, and I think Paul kind of answers that too. It's because he was talking about the market, because a lot of meat, even though it was clean meat, the common was the word. It's called common meat. So meat.
God would not have wanted us to eat with Canaanites in their service.
In their service, like in their presence?
In their fellowship, and well, that's the whole thing. It's to protect us and prevent us and keep us separate from worshiping.
Did you know Caleb? Did you know Caleb was a Canaanite?
For the influence.
Caleb was a Canaanite.
So Ruth was a Moabite, but.
So what's the difference there? They became Israelites, right? So anyway, it's not a bloodline thing.
They follow the Lord their God.
So we got Ruth. We got the girl from Jericho. I forget her name. Obviously a Canaanite or whatever. And Rahab, who Jesus is from the line of, and also Ruth. We have Caleb, one of the 12 spies, one of the leaders. Caleb actually means dog in Hebrew, which, remember, the Canaanite woman that Jesus talks to.
Oh, really? That's interesting. I didn't know that. That's cool.
He calls her a dog. But then, because...
Did he call her was it Samaritan woman or a Canaanite woman? You're right. He called her a dog.
It was a Canaanite woman.
It was Canaanite? Okay.
But because of her faith, right? So she believed, in a sense. So then that's when he changed his mind. It wasn't because who she was. It's actually she changed in that moment. She professed to believe in him, as Yeshua Messiah, and a believer in Yahweh, and recognizing that God. So that, and maybe in that moment, changed her from being a Canaanite into an Israelite. I guess we get stuck on bloodline. It's oh, you're not a Jew because you're not a bloodline Jew. But even when they left Egypt, it was a mixed multitude. There was Egyptians that went with them. There was other people in other people in Egypt that weren't from Abraham's line.
What about circumcision?
It's a good question. What about it? It's a specific commandment, but we don't know specifically how it was done. So in the medical world, it's done wrong. We know that. That's not biblical circumcision. And even the Jews today argue a lot over what is it just making a cut? if the foreskin doesn't go over the glands, sometimes they consider that already circumcised, and you just have to make a cut. Or, Brit is the same word as covenant. Brit gets the idea of cutting.
What about this Muslim practice of circumcising women?
It's not in scripture. I think it's barbaric. Nowhere in the Torah does it talk about circumcising women.
Mm-hmm.
As far as Muslims, I think they have the same. I think they worship Yahweh. I think there are Muslims that do. Like, we all recognize Abraham. Like Judaism, Islam, Christians, we all recognize Abraham as being the father and the God he worshipped. But Christians, we have Jesus as the prophet, and Muhammad for Islam, and Judaism just thinks Messiah hasn't come yet. But I think we all kind of recognize Yahweh as God. But the problem is we've created our own ideas of how God wants to be worshipped and what he wants us to do. That's why I think the Torah portions are so cool, because it kind of gives you an idea of how God thinks, his wisdom. I think that was one of the verses, like, I marked down here. My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. It's like, why would God do it that way? That's dumb. That doesn't make any sense, God. I'm going to do it this way. Or then thinking like, well, maybe God is smarter than you, right? Just like as chiropractors, we say the body is intelligent, right? Where in the medical community thinks the body is an idiot. So that changes how we act. We're like, well, the body must be right. We got to work with the body. Whereas the medical community is like, oh, the body is dumb. We have to circumvent what the body's doing because it has no idea what it's doing. So two different approaches, just in that example. Whereas God has these laws for a reason, even if we don't understand them, like the law with cutting the beard and all that, and tattoos, which are whole other conversations. It's like, well, that doesn't make any sense. That's dumb. That must be for another time. Or maybe there's just an understanding there that we haven't reached yet.
Okay.
Like, we've just learned very recently that shrimp and lobsters, what they do to eat, and the science behind that. I think science is slowly proving the existence of God over time. Everything in the Bible it's been made more sense of than it has in the past. So just going on faith that what he says is true and that you should follow it. And there's probably a reason, even if you don't understand it or may ever understand it.
Well, every time you turn around, there's a new discovery in Israel that proves the Bible accurate.
Well, we're going to church. Do you want to finish this conversation later?
No, I don't want you at church. Yeah, go ahead. Have a good evening.
I'm playing the drums.
So I do have a question for you. You said you booked your flight. Are you flying into JFK or are you flying into Wilkes-Barre? Where are you flying in?
Still flying into JFK.
Okay, so I have step-by-step directions for getting on the AirTran first and then the subway to get you to Port Authority. So I'll send those to you. It'll probably make it a little bit easier.
Why don't you send those to me, because your ways are higher than my ways, and your understanding is more than my understanding.
Danielle and I just came back, and I made real careful notes so that I would have it, because we've been doing it, but I never really wrote it all down before, so I actually have the exact line and everything down for you, so I'll send it to you.
All right, thank you. Shabbat shalom, right, Father, Mother.
Shabbat shalom. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.